What if the Great Flood of 1993, the one etched into America's memory as a disaster of historic proportions, wasn't unique at all? What if what we once called a once-in-a-lifetime catastrophe is now repeating itself with alarming frequency? And what if comparing that past disaster to today's floods reveals not just the scale of water, but the scale of change in the way we live, build, and survive? In the summer of 1993, the Midwest of the United States experienced what would become known as the Great Flood of 1993. Over the course of months, rivers swelled beyond recognition, breaking records and breaching levees across 9 states. The Mississippi and Missouri rivers were the central players, transforming farmland, small towns, and cities into vast inland seas. Entire communities were submerged. More than 50 people died. Tens of thousands of homes were destroyed, and the economic damages were estimated at between $15 to $20 billion, staggering at the time. The flood lasted for months, creating a psychological weight as heavy as the waters themselves. To those who lived through it, the flood of 1993 seemed like an anomaly, a convergence of record rainfall, swollen rivers, and infrastructure failures that would not likely be seen again for generations. Farmers spoke of losing everything, in a way that suggested permanence. Residents of small towns told reporters, "We'll be telling our grandchildren about this one." Yet just 3 decades later, many of those same regions, along with countless others, face floods that rival or surpass what was once called historic. What changed? Why does the past no longer feel distant, but eerily close? To compare the flood of 1993 with floods today, we must look first at the drivers. In 1993, the Midwest experienced extraordinary rainfall over several months, saturating soils and overwhelming river systems. It was largely a weather event, albeit one magnified by human development along riverbanks. By contrast, floods today are often fueled not only by heavy rainfall, but by climate change itself. Warmer air holds more moisture, leading to more intense downpours. Sea levels are higher, amplifying storm surges. Hurricanes powered by warmer oceans are stronger and slower, dumping massive amounts of water on coastal and inland communities alike. What was once rare is becoming routine. The infrastructure story also reveals a striking difference. In 1993, many of the levees and flood defenses in the Midwest were outdated, poorly maintained, or simply overwhelmed by the scale of water. Since then, billions have been spent to upgrade defenses across the country. Yet, despite these investments, flooding persists. Why? Because our defenses are still designed around the past, not the accelerating realities of the present. Seawalls and levees can hold back water up to a point, but when rainfall breaks records every few years instead of every century, systems designed for yesterday's risks cannot protect against today's extremes. Another key difference lies in the human landscape. In 1993, the areas hardest hit were largely rural, farmland, small towns, and river communities. Today, floods often strike densely populated urban areas, amplifying their impact. Think of Houston during Hurricane Harvey in 2017, where a modern metropolis was paralyzed by days of relentless rain. Think of New York City during Hurricane Sandy in 2012, where subways flooded and millions were left without power. Urban sprawl has paved over natural absorption zones, such as wetlands and prairies, replacing them with asphalt and concrete that channel water into streets and homes. The result is not just more flooding, but more expensive and socially disruptive flooding. Economically, the comparison is sobering. The $20 billion cost of the 1993 flood was considered astronomical at the time, but in today's dollars it pales in comparison to recent disasters. Hurricane Harvey's damages exceeded $125 billion. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 caused more than $160 billion in losses. Even smaller floods in Midwest towns now regularly run into the billions. The scale of economic loss is magnified by population growth, urban expansion, and the sheer value of modern infrastructure. Where 1993 destroyed farmland and homes, today's floods destroy highways, airports, power grids, and digital infrastructure, paralyzing entire regions. The insurance industry's perspective highlights this escalation. After 1993, flood insurance payouts were substantial but manageable. Today, insurers are withdrawing from entire states, refusing to cover homes in flood-prone areas. Premiums are skyrocketing, leaving families unprotected. This would have been unthinkable in 1993, when insurance was viewed as a stable backstop. Now, even the government's National Flood Insurance Program is drowning in debt, reflecting the unsustainable costs of repeated disasters. Psychologically, the difference is just as stark. In 1993, the flood was experienced as a singular event, a tragedy to remember, but not a way of life. Survivors could rebuild with the hope that such devastation would not return for decades. Today, floods are not one-off memories, but recurring realities. Families in Louisiana, Florida, or along the Mississippi now rebuild with the uneasy knowledge that another flood may come next year, or even next month. The emotional weight is no longer tied to a historic anomaly, but to chronic insecurity. Yet there are also similarities that tie the past and present together. In both eras, communities rallied in remarkable ways. In 1993, volunteers filled sandbags, neighbors sheltered one another, and towns rebuilt together. The same spirit was seen during Harvey, Sandy, and countless other floods since. Human resilience endures, even as the challenges multiply. But resilience alone is no longer enough. The repeated nature of modern floods requires not just recovery, but transformation. When comparing 1993 to today, it becomes clear that floods are not simply natural disasters. In both then and now, human decisions amplify risk. Building homes and businesses in floodplains, draining wetlands, underinvesting in infrastructure. All of these choices made communities more vulnerable in 1993, and they continue to do so now. The difference is that in today's climate, the stakes are higher and the timeline is shorter. The lessons of 1993 should have been a wake-up call. They showed that rivers could swell beyond expectation, that levees could fail, that the costs of underestimating water were immense. But instead of fundamentally rethinking our relationship with rivers and coasts, we often chose to double down, rebuilding in place and trusting that technology or luck would suffice. Today, that gamble is running out of time. The floods of the 21st century are not isolated tragedies, but warnings of a new normal. So what does this comparison tell us? That what once seemed extraordinary is becoming ordinary. That the line between historic and routine is blurring. And that if the Great Flood of 1993 was once a benchmark for disaster, today's floods are setting new benchmarks at a frightening pace. Looking back, the flood of 1993 was a turning point. Looking forward, it may one day be seen not as an outlier, but as the beginning of an era when floods stopped being rare and started being relentless. The challenge for our generation is to learn from both the past and the present, to see the continuity, to recognize the escalation, and to prepare for a future where floods are not anomalies but expectations. The comparison is not meant to inspire despair, but urgency. If the 1993 flood showed us how vulnerable we could be, today's floods show us how urgent it is to adapt. The choice now is whether we use these lessons to build resilience that matches the scale of the challenge, or whether we allow history to repeat itself, again and again, with ever greater costs. When comparing the historic flood of 1993 to the floods of today, one of the most striking contrasts lies in the context in which these disasters occur. The Great Flood of 1993 was devastating in scope, but it was largely understood at the time as an extraordinary act of nature. Today, floods are not interpreted in isolation. They are seen within the broader framework of climate change, urbanization, and systemic vulnerabilities that make disasters less about chance and more about inevitability. In 1993, the causes were fairly straightforward. Months of persistent rainfall, saturated soils, and swollen rivers that overwhelmed levees and flood defenses. The damage was monumental, but there was still the prevailing sense that this was a freak event, unlikely to repeat in the near future. Today, however, we know better. Climate science has shown that warmer air holds more moisture, leading to heavier rainfall. Oceans are warmer, feeding storms with more energy. Sea levels are higher, amplifying coastal surges. What was once rare is now expected. Where 1993 was an anomaly, today's floods are part of a pattern that is accelerating. Technology is another key differentiator. In 1993, early warning systems were far less advanced. Communities relied heavily on local weather reports, word of mouth, and physical observation of river levels. When levees broke, there was often little time to react. Today, technology provides more precise forecasting, satellite imagery, and real-time alerts. Governments can issue evacuation orders earlier, and individuals can track storm paths on their phones. Yet, despite these advances, floods still wreak havoc. This reveals a sobering truth. Technology can improve preparedness, but it cannot prevent the physical forces at play. Forecasting helps save lives, but it does not stop the waters from rising or the infrastructure from failing. Infrastructure itself highlights another contrast. The levees of 1993 were often outdated or insufficient, unable to withstand prolonged pressure. After the disaster, billions were spent to reinforce flood defenses. Yet, 3 decades later, floods continue to breach these barriers. Why? Because defenses are built to protect against a certain level of risk, often based on outdated assumptions of what is normal. With climate change, those assumptions are no longer valid. A levee designed for a 100-year flood may now face multiple severe floods in a single decade. What seemed like robust protection after 1993 is proving inadequate today. Urbanization adds another layer. In 1993, much of the damage was rural. Farms underwater, small towns destroyed, vast agricultural losses. Cities were affected, but the rural impact was dominant. Today, the story has shifted. Urban sprawl has expanded dramatically, paving over natural wetlands and floodplains. Concrete and asphalt replace absorbent soils, creating rapid runoff that overwhelms drainage systems. This means floods in today's world strike densely populated areas, causing more economic loss and more disruption to daily life. A flooded farm devastates livelihoods, but a flooded metropolis can cripple entire economies. Economically, the scale has also changed. The damages from the 1993 flood, around $15 to $20 billion, were shocking at the time. But in the decades since, floods regularly cause damages that dwarf that number. Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Sandy, each caused tens or hundreds of billions in losses. Even smaller floods, like those caused by Midwest river overflows in the 2010s, have crossed the billion-dollar mark. This escalation is not just due to inflation or rising property values. It reflects the greater concentration of assets in vulnerable areas and the broader reach of flood impacts in interconnected economies. Insurance tells a story of mounting fragility. After 1993, flood insurance claims surged, but the system remained functional. Today, insurance markets are buckling. Private insurers are exiting flood-prone areas, citing unsustainable risks. The National Flood Insurance Program is drowning in debt, raising premiums and leaving families with impossible choices. Without insurance, properties lose value. Without value, banks hesitate to lend. The result is a dangerous cycle. Financial retreat mirrors physical retreat, leaving homeowners stranded in homes they cannot protect, sell, or insure. The human perception of flooding has also shifted. In 1993, survivors spoke of the flood as a once-in-a-lifetime event. Communities rebuilt with the belief that the worst was behind them. Today, floods are no longer perceived as rare. They are expected, even routine in some areas. This shift creates psychological fatigue. People are weary of rebuilding, weary of evacuating, wary of living with uncertainty. In Louisiana, some families have rebuilt 3 or 4 times in the past 2 decades. In parts of the Midwest, the phrase flood season is now common, reflecting a grim acceptance that disaster is cyclical, not exceptional. Culturally, the response to flooding reflects a broader change in how we think about resilience. In 1993, resilience meant returning to normal, rebuilding the same house, the same town, the same way of life. Today, resilience increasingly means adaptation. Some communities are raising homes on stilts. Others are redesigning parks and public spaces to absorb water. Still others are engaging in managed retreat, relocating entire neighborhoods out of flood zones. This marks a profound shift in mindset, from resisting nature to learning to live with it. Yet, despite these differences, the comparison between 1993 and today also reveals continuity. Both then and now, human choices magnified natural forces. Building in floodplains, draining wetlands, failing to maintain infrastructure, these decisions made the 1993 flood worse, and they continue to make today's floods more destructive. Both then and now, communities rallied with courage and solidarity, neighbors helping neighbors, volunteers filling sandbags, first responders risking their lives. And both then and now, policymakers face the same dilemma: how much to invest in prevention versus how much to spend on recovery. The critical difference is urgency. In 1993, the flood was a wake-up call. Today, the alarms are constant. Climate change has transformed what was once considered rare into the new normal. Policymakers can no longer frame floods as isolated tragedies. They must plan for recurrence, escalation, and permanence. The 1993 flood taught us that water could defy our expectations. Today's floods remind us that those expectations must be rewritten entirely. Looking deeper, the comparison underscores a central truth. Floods are not just about water. They are about systems: ecological, economic, social, and political. In 1993, the system broke under extraordinary pressure. Today, the system is strained not only by extraordinary events, but by ordinary ones that happen with increasing force and frequency. The Great Flood of 1993 was a test. Today's floods are a curriculum, teaching us that adaptation is no longer optional, but essential. To ignore the comparison is to miss the trajectory. In 1993, a historic flood shocked the nation. Today, historic floods occur every few years, sometimes multiple times in the same region. This does not diminish the suffering of those who endured 1993, but it highlights the scale of what is unfolding now. If we consider 1993 the beginning of the modern flood era, then the past 3 decades have been a steady escalation, moving from anomaly to pattern, from surprise to inevitability. The lessons are clear. Technology helps but cannot save us alone. Infrastructure must be reimagined, not just rebuilt. Insurance and finance must adapt to new realities, and resilience must mean transformation, not repetition. Above all, we must stop treating each flood as a unique tragedy and start recognizing them as symptoms of a broader shift. The comparison between the Great Flood of 1993 and today's floods is not about nostalgia or statistics. It is about perspective. It shows how much has changed and how much remains the same. It warns us that yesterday's historic is today's ordinary. And it challenges us to ask whether tomorrow's ordinary will be something we can survive at all. The Great Flood of 1993 is remembered as a disaster of staggering scale, a calamity that brought the mighty rivers of the Midwest to their knees and left entire communities underwater for months. But in comparing that historic flood with the floods of today, a sobering realization emerges. What once seemed like an extraordinary event has become, in many ways, a glimpse into the future we are now living. The differences are stark, the similarities are haunting, and the trajectory is unmistakable. In 1993, the Mississippi and Missouri rivers rose relentlessly after months of torrential rains. Levees broke, towns were swallowed, farmland was destroyed, and lives were lost. The images shocked the nation. Yet for most Americans, the flood was framed as an outlier, an extreme disaster to be remembered but not repeated anytime soon. People rebuilt with the hope, or perhaps the illusion, that such an event was unlikely to return within their lifetimes. Fast forward to today, and that assumption has dissolved. Floods have not only returned, they have intensified, diversified, and expanded. Where the 1993 flood was largely a product of extraordinary weather over time, today's floods are fueled by systemic changes in the climate. Heavier rainfall, stronger storms, and rising seas have turned historic into frequent. Every few years, somewhere in the United States or around the globe, another flood emerges that rivals or surpasses the 1993 benchmark. The comparison reveals several striking contrasts. First, the geography of flooding has shifted. In 1993, rural farmland bore much of the damage. Towns were destroyed, but the impact was often spread across wide agricultural regions. Today, urban centers dominate the headlines. Cities like Houston, New York, Miami, and New Orleans have become poster children for climate-driven flooding. Urban sprawl has transformed natural floodplains into dense neighborhoods, commercial zones, and highways. When water rises now, it disrupts millions of lives, cripples transportation systems, and destabilizes financial markets. The sheer concentration of people and assets in vulnerable areas has multiplied the consequences of flooding. Second, the economic scale has escalated beyond comparison. The 1993 flood caused $15 to $20 billion in damages, an extraordinary sum at the time. Yet in the last 2 decades, individual storms and floods have regularly caused damages 5 or 10 times that amount. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 inflicted over $160 billion in losses. Hurricane Harvey in 2017 caused more than $125 billion in damages. Even floods considered regional often run into billions today. The difference lies not only in inflation, but in the fact that modern society is more interconnected, more dependent on fragile systems, and more costly to repair. Third, the cycle of insurance and finance has collapsed. In 1993, insurance payouts were massive but manageable. Flood insurance was still broadly available, and banks were still confident in issuing loans. Today, that landscape has changed dramatically. Private insurers have pulled out of flood-prone areas, leaving homeowners reliant on the heavily indebted National Flood Insurance Program. Premiums have soared, making insurance unaffordable for many. Without insurance, properties lose value. Without value, banks retreat. And without loans, families cannot rebuild. The financial architecture that once supported resilience is crumbling under the weight of repeated disasters. Fourth, the perception of time has shifted. Survivors of 1993 described it as a once-in-a-lifetime disaster. Today, many families in Louisiana, Texas, Florida, and the Midwest have endured multiple historic floods within a single generation. The phrase 100-year flood has become a bitter joke, as neighborhoods experience so-called 100-year events every few years. What was once rare is now routine, and this shift creates a deep sense of fatigue. Communities are not just rebuilding. They are rebuilding again and again, with diminishing hope that things will ever change. And yet, amid these differences, the comparison also highlights enduring themes. In both 1993 and today, human choices have made floods worse. Building in vulnerable areas, draining wetlands, and neglecting infrastructure have compounded the risks nature presents. In both eras, communities have shown remarkable resilience. Neighbors helping neighbors, volunteers filling sandbags, and first responders working tirelessly to save lives. And in both, policymakers have faced the same dilemma: whether to invest in prevention or accept the cost of repeated recovery. But here lies the crucial divergence. In 1993, the nation could still tell itself that prevention was optional. Today, that illusion has vanished. The evidence is overwhelming. Climate change is reshaping the rhythm of floods, and the price of inaction is rising with every storm. So, what can we learn from this comparison? First, that technology and infrastructure must evolve faster than the waters rise. Levees, dams, and drainage systems built for the risks of the past cannot withstand the realities of today. Investing in green infrastructure, wetlands, permeable pavements, floodable parks offers more sustainable protection. But even these measures require political will and sustained funding. Second, that financial systems must adapt to climate realities. Banks, insurers, and governments cannot continue to treat floods as anomalies. They must price risk honestly, even if it disrupts housing markets in the short term. At the same time, they must ensure that vulnerable communities are not abandoned. Without equitable access to insurance, credit, and support, entire regions will collapse into cycles of poverty and decline. Third, that adaptation must be cultural as well as technical. Resilience cannot mean simply bouncing back to the same vulnerable state. It must mean reimagining how and where we live. For some communities, that will mean building differently. For others, it will mean relocating entirely. Managed retreat is one of the most difficult conversations we can have, but it is one we cannot avoid. Finally, that urgency is our greatest need. The Great Flood of 1993 was a wake-up call. Today's floods are the alarm that won't stop ringing. The choice before us is not whether floods will come, they will, but whether we will act decisively enough to reduce their toll. The story of the Great Flood of 1993 and today's floods is ultimately a story about perspective. 30 years ago, a flood that overwhelmed the Mississippi and Missouri rivers seemed like a once-in-a-century event. Today, it feels like a preview of what is to come, repeated across different geographies with increasing frequency. The comparison reminds us that history is not just something to remember, it is something to learn from. And the lesson is clear. Yesterday's extraordinary is today's ordinary, and tomorrow's extraordinary will be beyond anything we have yet endured unless we change course. This is not just about rivers and rainfall. It is about how we plan our cities, how we design our infrastructure, how we finance our homes, and how we confront the reality of a changing planet. The comparison between 1993 and today is not an academic exercise, it is a warning. If we fail to heed it, the floods of the future will not just rival 1993, they will make it look small. At Crisis Lens, we are committed to shining light on these hidden truths, to connecting the dots between past and present, and to helping you see the patterns that shape our future. Floods are no longer anomalies, they are signals, and ignoring them is no longer an option. If this perspective has opened your eyes, don't let the conversation stop here. Subscribe to Crisis Lens for more in-depth analysis of the crises shaping our world. Like and share this video to spread awareness, because the more people understand the stakes, the more prepared we can all be. And watch the full series to see how floods, storms, fires, and other disasters are rewriting the rules of survival in the 21st century. The waters are rising, the storms are intensifying, and history is repeating itself faster than ever. The question is not whether we will be tested, it is whether we will be ready.